A lot of people have been expecting XRP to do extremely well into the end of the year. Matter of fact, we were expecting crypto to do really well into the end of the year, considering November tends to be a really strong month, heck, even the end of October. But instead, all we got was a massive, arguably the largest liquidation event in history on the 10th, which acted as a good measure for a reset in leverage and would allow for the markets to potentially start to recover. But that's not what we've seen. And instead, from this massive liquidation event, the market rallied just slightly back up to 266 and then started dumping yet again for new local lows down to 207, which seems to be a pretty strong range of support. However, if this does break down, things are going to look pretty nasty. And so a lot of people in the community are quite confused about why this is happening when we have such positive developments in news on the Ripple front. And it's important to note, if you're new here or you've been involved in XRP for quite some time, at the end of the day, the Ripple company is completely separate from the XRP token. There are a lot of creative ways in which they could potentially build out the current infrastructure they have acquired through 6 different companies over the last 2 years into the XRP ledger, where XRP is the backbone and the token that you will use to transact for fees. But at the end of the day, these acquisitions are completely separate, as is the RLUSD stablecoin, which can be used on private ledgers they build for different banks, institutions, and even inside of any of these companies. They don't have to use the XRPL, although it would be to their benefit, considering the majority of that 40 billion XRP that is sitting in the escrow will eventually come into the market. And the real question is, will they want to sell it in order to do more acquisitions, or will they want to find creative ways to build out these companies inside of the XRPL, or maybe start to reposition some of these transactions on the XRPL that XRP might benefit from it? But still, when you see this much positive news for Ripple, it should affect the price of XRP and allow for it to pump to the upside. Because that is not happening, and because we're in a very weak macro outlook or an environment, this leads me to believe that the top for the year is actually in, and that's not something everyone wants to hear, but the price action is also telling the exact same story. So this is all great for the Ripple company, considering they are now valued at $40 billion. They've consistently been repurchasing 25% of their shares, but again, those shares are not XRP. They're buying shares of the Ripple company, which yes, does have seed investors, Series A investors, Series B investors, and operates like a private company. So in the long run, all of this stuff will be good for the price action on XRP, but potentially not through the end of the year. And I get it. Listen, people are going to call me a bear. They're going to call me an idiot, but I've been talking about this for quite some time now. Now, one of the most bullish things that I can see happening in the future for the XRPL is if a lot of those transactions for their stablecoin, the RLUSD, move on chain, which would drive more demand for the XRP token to move that RLUSD. But this would require a lot of transactions in the RLUSD stablecoin, and right now they are growing. They hit another $1 billion market cap just the other day and have grown that fast in about a year. So I believe they're going to continue to grow and probably even quadruple this next year because of their key acquisition of Hidden Road. But if you haven't already recognized it, stablecoins are arguably one of the most crucial developments in blockchain history. And at the end of the day, many cryptos are going to end up doing nothing and go to zero, while stablecoin market will continue to grow because they will be the largest buyers of US treasuries. In other words, they are going to get support from the United States government, and everyone around the world wants US dollars, so they can get them in the form of digital US dollars made stable coins, which is why Ripple was really smart to develop their own, acquire all these companies, and hopefully start integrating that stablecoin in all of their payments globally. These are a lot of acquisitions, and yes, the RLUSD stablecoin is going to continue to grow, which will be settled on the XRP ledger. And so another really cool development is the fact that they're partnering with MasterCard and Gemini in order to use that Gemini XRP credit card, which will give you some cash back, I think in the form of XRP. And so key partnerships like this will continue to grow adoption and demand for either the RLUSD stablecoin and XRP XRP, which will live on the ledger. But at the end of the day, again, we want to see this work its way into the price of XRP, and all we've seen right now is dumping, which again leads me to believe that there's far more weakness and not enough demand. When you combine that with the fact that crypto market leverage is still through the roof, that does not create for a healthy environment. We've now set a new record of $73.6 billion in crypto loans, which can be liquidated in the case of another major bearish event or a black swan, which surpassed the previous record of $69.4 billion in Q4 of 2021. And guess what? That is when the crypto market crashed into a bear market of 2022. In other words, even with that mass liquidation event, we still have a ton of leverage on the loan side, which means things can get nastier before they get better. And we're already starting to see the cracks in the market, which I will cover. And if you've been a student of mine or watching these videos for some time, I believe the chart tells us the story before the news does. Usually by the time everyone's crying bear market, we're deep into one. Peter Brandt did call the exact cycle top essentially for Bitcoin, which led its way into the XRP market, and all cryptos essentially are tied pretty closely to the stock market. So if we see the stock market doing poorly, it's likely that risk on asset classes like crypto, which are more volatile, are going to do poorly as well. And Peter Brandt just made a post that is kind of scary. It says 4 signs the high is in for the S&P 500 for the next 4 or 5 years. Now, we don't really know if it's going to last that long. I don't think it will for crypto because we're going to see a lot of adoption over the next coming years. Either way, he did post about this exhaustion gap, about a gravestone doji candle, the fact that we are now getting a signal on the Hindenburg Omen signal, which is typical of tops. And he said you can read more on it right here. The fact that not only did he call the exhaustion gap, but it's been filled for 6 days of lower highs, and we're getting a macro backdrop that is arguably worsening. And so with all of these key signals, I do think it's important to just be a bit more cautious than normal. If this really was the top, and I'm starting to believe it is, then this was one of the weakest bull markets in crypto history. And I would argue it is because institutions have entered. Usually people were saying when institutions enter, and then we get an altcoin cycle, Bitcoin dominance drops, and everyone's going to be rich, but that's just not the case. We have to remember institutions can make money on the upside. They can also make money on the downside. So this market just becomes more difficult as more savvy investors enter with far more capital. So now let's dive into the price action as well as a few other metrics to see if we can't get a better picture of what's going to happen next. Again, we have to remember that the news should actually be a signal, but it doesn't always tell you what you are actually reading. You need to test that against the price action. If the price action is very weak while the news is very positive, that simply means that the news is not pricing itself in or has already been priced in. So the price action you see right now in a positive news cycle leads me to believe that we are done trending to the upside for quite a while. That doesn't mean that these developments on the Ripple side or the team over at Ripple can eventually make a lot of those developments or acquisitions play a role in the XRP token. It simply means that right now the XRP token has priced in that news, and we're already looking bearish with the all-time high coming in here at about 366. Since that point in time, and we've covered this quite a bit here, we put in a series of lows at about $2.73 to 70 cents, which acted as a pretty strong support. Then we had a series of lower highs where we first got our lower low, we could even argue right here, which is lower than the prior low, and our next high, which is lower than this high. So you can see we have a series of what? Lower lows and lower highs for a downtrend, which leads me to believe we're going to continue trending to the downside. And now it looks like XRP is struggling to break back above 234, which is a range now resistance. What used to be a support or should have been a support becomes a resistance. You can see we touched it once here, twice, 3 times, 4 times before breaking out. Then we were supported once and twice, and now we are breaking down below the range and struggling to stay above it. Leads me to believe again we're likely coming back down to another range support right over here at 207, and this will be the final straw that potentially breaks the camel's back before breaking lower to about 160 yet again. In other words, if you're someone that's just an XRP investor, you want to hold over the long term, understand that you are likely carrying more risk the larger your position is. But if you think 10 years from now it's going to be $5, $10, $100, then buying dips into these ranges is smarter than adding right here. That said, I'm no longer adding a risk to my portfolio. I'm not buying dips, I'm actually shorting into rips. And that's not because I want to hate on XRP or anything. It's just that's what the trend is telling me. And again, the trend is my friend. I'm simply trying to be on the right side of the market. I'm not trying to be right. Even right now, Bitcoin is struggling to break back into its range. Yes, it's seeing a support around $101,000, but now it has a lot of overhead resistance to break back above between 106 to 107. So the only time I'd want to start to take long positions on XRP or start to buy some of these cryptos is into strength. If Bitcoin can get back above $107,000 and hold it for at least a week, then I'd be more inclined to buy other cryptos like XRP. But if Bitcoin starts to break below 101, which right now it is in now officially a shorter term downtrend from that high on October 6th, then things can get pretty nasty for the rest of the crypto market. But you can even see here, Bitcoin is now below its prior range support. So what used to be a support now becomes a resistance. This 107 level is going to be a major resistance, and Bitcoin truly needs to hold the line here in order for XRP to do well.